After weeks-long trial testimony that included dozens of witnesses, as you know, Anne-Marie, and hours of harrowing video, including rewatching that video over and over and over again, we now know, of course, that Derek Chauvin has been found guilty of killing George Floyd. The former Minneapolis police officer was convicted yesterday of murder and manslaughter. Following the jury's quick verdict, Chauvin was immediately handcuffed and taken into custody. He could be sent to prison for decades. Across the country, the verdict brought waves of relief to those following the trial closely. At a news conference, George Floyd's brother told the nation, "Today, we are able to breathe again."
So for more on this, we want to bring in Christiane Cordero. She is a reporter for our CBS station in Minneapolis. Christiane, thanks for joining us this morning. You are on the ground there. You know, we all watched the coverage of the reaction right after the verdict. There was elation. There were, in some cases, tears of joy. What has it been like since then?
It was the spontaneity of that moment, Anne-Marie. Good morning to you as well. I was standing in this courtyard yesterday, just in front of the courtroom where the verdict was being read. There were hundreds of people there. And actually what stood out to me the most as I kind of reflect on it now 12 or so hours later was the moment right before the verdict was read. There was this deafening silence among the hundreds of people who had came here to gather. As Judge Peter Cahill stood up in the courtroom, welcomed the jury in, and started reading. In that silence, you felt the gravity of the moment of people really holding on to whatever the fate would be on the other side of it. And as you mentioned, that elation as soon as that first guilty verdict was read was so genuine from the people who were here. It was relief for a city that has endured so much trauma, and of course, an acknowledgement of a community that has dealt with so much trauma long before George Floyd's death last summer.
Yeah, Christiane, I know you reflected on that in an Instagram post. You reflected on what it's been like over the course of the 330 days since we learned of George Floyd's killing to the moment when this verdict was read yesterday in that courtroom. What was it like in the courtroom as Judge Cahill read that jury's verdict?
It was quiet, Vlad. I would imagine it was similar to a lot of households who were watching around America, and certainly similar to the courtyard just outside of it. Usually, throughout the trial itself, there has been this juxtaposition of sorts of just the very strict confines of the courtroom, and then the electricity outside of it, the energy from people who came to show up. But inside the courtroom, it was quiet. I will say, as somebody who watched jury selection very closely, it was a reflection of all types of people across Hennepin County. Hennepin County is interesting because it has Minneapolis, the state's largest city. It also has in the far western suburbs, very small towns, actually, farmland. So you saw in that courtroom 12 people who reflected a whole lot of different parts of not even just Hennepin County, but different voices from across America were reflected in that courtroom, and they all came to a consensus, albeit very quickly, relative to what most people were expecting.
You know, I saw George Floyd's brother speak yesterday, and he said something to the effect, paraphrasing, that they are celebrating in the moment, but that he recognized that there was more work to be done. So what are activists saying about the work that needs to be done moving forward to address systemic issues, racism in policing, over-policing, and issues within the criminal justice system?
You know, Anne-Marie, I think it was the first step was the acknowledgement that those systemic issues exist. That is so much of what we saw last summer. And I think that the relief for what happened yesterday, you know, based on the conversations I had with people, was that this felt like a very important first step, but the emphasis on the first step. One of the more pivotal moments, it seemed, in the courtroom throughout the trial itself was when Chief Madera Arredondo, Minneapolis police chief, took the stand. And he was essentially presented with the option to defend the occupation or to defend the officer, and he chose the occupation. We haven't always seen that in other police trials. So I think that, you know, as the community, many parts of the community, right, in South Minneapolis, North Minneapolis, in the city as a whole, there are a lot of people who back the police chief, and he wants to see transformative change. And so they essentially, a lot of people are trying to give him the platform and the option to do so. But as you said, there is work to be done to acknowledge a lot of the pain and a lot of the grief that people have felt for a long time, and the mistrust as well. So I think that, the path to healing, whatever that looks like, certainly won't be linear. It hasn't been up until this point. But the moment was very real of acknowledging that this felt like a first step.
Christiane, you make a good point about the trust from the community along with police officers. And of course, we had never seen a police chief testify against one of his own. But I want to ask you about, and specifically because you are there on the ground in Minneapolis, and that is your beat, for lack of a better word, that statement that the police released 330 days ago, somewhere about, of the George Floyd arrest and his death. How, when you read that now with the eyes of today, how different it sounds and it looks, and how are people in the community able to trust the police if a statement like that says that a man in the process of being arrested died because of natural causes or because of his health conditions, which we now know to not be true based on the verdicts yesterday?
Right. It feels like it validates the need for having, we're so tempted these days, I think so many of us, to put things into the rigid confines of good and evil, of trust and mistrust. And sometimes we need to sit with a little bit of perplexity and a lot of questions. And the city has done that for the better part of the past year. The other thing that is very obvious following that statement that was initially published after George Floyd's death, and then seeing where we are almost a year later, is the video that Darnella Frazier recorded and published on social media. That is what changed this entire case. That is what changed this entire movement. And so you think about a 17-year-old girl who literally became an adult in the course of this year, in every way possible, turning 18, I believe it was in March. Her ability to bring transparency to what happened, I think it speaks volumes for where we are as a society, and being able to question things and sit with those questions for a little bit and hold people accountable when that option presents itself. Indeed.
Christiane Cordero, always great to have you. Thank you so much for your reporting throughout this entirety of this, from the moment that George Floyd was killed to this verdict. We appreciate it.